Hello and welcome to Emsi webinars. We are really excited today to be joined by Emsi's Executive Vice President of Global Operations, Andy Durman. Wow, that's a mouthful. And also VP of Innovation, Duncan. We also have David Allison, who is the CEO and founder of GetMyFirstJob. So it's going to be a really good webinar today. If you have any questions, please put them into your control panel and we'll endeavour to get to those at the end of the presentation. If we don't have time, then we will follow up later in emails. We will be sending you a follow-up email with the recording and slides, so keep your eyes open for that. So without any further ado, looking forward to today. Hi, Andy.
Hi Debbie, thank you very much, and hello everyone. Thank you for joining us, and apologies for the postponement. The original date is still on the screen there. It is not Wednesday the 8th. You do have a fewer days to get your Christmas shopping sorted. Sorry, but thanks for accommodating that change with a few unforeseen circumstances we had to work through there. But we are here. And some good content to run through today. I'm very excited to have Duncan joining as ever, and he'll be coming in and showing us, talking us through some exciting and interesting numbers. And David later on will be joining us to discuss some of the trends that we're seeing and how that's manifesting in the world that his business spends time in. So thank you very much for joining us. As always, welcome to long-time viewers and welcome back for those new to us. A quick intro. Our goal here at Emsi Burning Glass is to help organizations make better decisions about the labor market and help their communities make clear decisions that are beneficial to the labour markets they sit within through the provision of detailed, granular labour market information, so we can understand what's going on out there. And of course, part of the role of these webinars is to try and illuminate what we're seeing in our data and help you think about how that might influence the work that you do in the communities that you serve. And thank you for all the work that you do, particularly at a time of great change and challenge in the labour market. So thank you very much. So last time we were joined once again by David from GetMyFirstJob, and last time we really set out the context of what's happening in the labour market, particularly thinking around how the labour market is really tightening up as the economy was going gangbusters as we came to accommodate and work through the pandemic, recent pandemic over the last few years. And we looked at that more generally, but also dived into understanding a bit more of David's world, which is that at the younger end of the labour market and often new entrants into the labour market. And what we discovered really was that the issues, the tightening of the labour market certainly was influencing, particularly at the apprenticeship end, with demand for apprentices increasing quite considerably, but not necessarily yet seeing that pool of candidates necessarily adapting, and therefore there being a significant tightening of the apprenticeship market as much as the wider labour market. And a lot of that comes down to the natural academic cycles of student availability. But what we did start to see was a hint and an interesting discussion with David about how candidates maybe are becoming slightly pickier with more options at their disposal. It very much is a candidate market, and so we were certainly seeing that the way in which employers were positioning apprenticeships was potentially influencing where those finite pool of candidates were spending most of their time focusing. And that's actually something that we'll be digging into a bit more today. Now, you can actually read a summary report of those topics, part one of this series that we're putting together. Head over to the Emsi Burning Glass UK website, jump on the blog, and you will find part one that goes into the detail of the summary that we provided. So this time we are going to dig a little deeper and build on that, and particular dive into three key focus sectors that help really illuminate what's happening with specific subsectors of the apprenticeship market. And again, thank you very much to David for sharing some of his valuable data to help us understand that in the context of the labour market. Then we will broaden our review and just continue to track the latest state of the labour market and in particular then share with you some new research that we've undertaken about what we're seeing in employer hiring activity that hints towards how employers might be responding and adjusting to this new environment of a very, very tight labour market. And from there, we'll reintroduce David to get his opinions and thoughts on what we're seeing. So it should be an interesting program today, this morning. So I'm going to bring in Duncan. Duncan, welcome.
Hello, Andy. How are you?
Yes, pregnant pause. Started to worry a bit.
Yeah.
No, thank you very much for joining us. So, as I say, I provided a brief summary of what we looked at last time, but you've done a bit of digging further into more specific aspects of the sort of supply-demand scenario. So I'm going to hand over to you now to walk us through those.
Yeah, absolutely. So I should thank David for doing most of the work. I just put them into pretty colours on the slides. So what we have here is, because Get My First Job has is a job board, they can track both the numbers of vacancies and also the numbers of applications against them. And so one of the things that we are really interested in, and I think this will be the running theme of today's webinar, is this kind of question of how the labour market is responding to its tightness that we've seen sort of really accelerate over the past few months. And so one obvious dimension of labour market tightness is pay. We would expect to see that as the market becomes more of a seller's market, applicants become more responsive to higher levels of pay and possibly a bit more choosy about where they're spending their time. And this is quite an interesting setting as well, because Get My First Job is focused on education leavers, so it's not like they are kind of ready-baked employees. Normally they kind of are at an early stage in their career, and so employers are hiring them with a view to investing in their skills as well. So it's quite an interesting test of this theory. And so what we can see here is that the dark blue lines are the number of applications in each of 4 pay bands. So as we go sort of left to right, we've got the very lowest paying up to £3.89. And then on the right hand side, we've got the very highest paying £8 to £20 an hour. And so the dark blue lines are the number of applications in each month. And then the orange lines, much lower, are the number of vacancies that those applications are against. And so the first thing to say is that you can see an increase in the volume of vacancies in every pay category. And in fact, the most rapid increase is actually in that sort of second category there, the £3.90 to £4.99. But what you can also see is that, first of all, applications are somewhat volatile. I mean, that reflects a variety of factors, including when people are leaving education, when people are sort of looking for jobs more. But you can see an interesting pattern in the sense that the very lowest paying, the number of applications is stable at a low level. And in the middle 2 categories, broadly the same, as they were before. Whereas it's in this, very volatile, as we've seen through the sort of the pandemic period, as we know. But then it's in this right-hand one where you see a relatively strong rise in the number of vacancies, similar, if not quite as robust as the sort of the 2 lower paying ones in the middle. But actually it's the applications are holding up better. And so it feels a bit like, from this initial kind of overall view, there are more applications coming in at the higher end of the labour market. And so applicants are becoming a bit pickier. And we've unpacked 3 different sectors to kind of explore that a bit more. So if you go on to the next slide. So we start with computing, which really does draw out that kind of feeling that actually applicants are becoming a lot more picky. So if you see here, the sort of the 2 middle ones are either stable or slightly declining in the number of applications, where it's at the high end. Although again it's very volatile, the underlying level seems to have really jolted upwards, much more than the number of vacancies that are there. And so that gives you a sense that people's alternative options are sufficient, that they're not rushing to go after any old job. They are going after the better paying ones. It's quite interesting when you look at the sort of 2 middle paying categories there, that in the most recent months, applications are barely more than the number of vacancies, so it's actually quite difficult to get people to apply for jobs in those middle paying categories. And of course, if you think about the candidates here, they're candidates who are interested in computing roles, who are, probably have some skills and qualifications in that setting, and so obviously they feel that they are much more likely to be getting a worthwhile opportunity by applying at the higher pay level, and not adding on as much interest in those middle and lower pay ranges. So if we go on to the next one, hospitality, which is of course an area that we've become very interested in with the recovery, and the orange lines here really tell the story of boom to bust to boom again with the pandemic, because it's affected the hospitality trade so much. And what you can see is that it's always difficult to get the number of applicants that you would want against vacancies in this sector. That may reflect the sort of the underlying employment model in the sector. And so it's pretty normal that vacancies sort of only apply a very low relative number of applications. But what you can see here is that the recent peak in vacancy demand has, in the middle pay ranges, taken them well in excess of the number of applications out there. So that there are, in the £3.90 to £4.99 range, several times as many vacancies as there are applications for them, which is pretty depressing if you're putting these job ads out there. Whereas in the high pay range, actually, there has been a much more one-to-one relationship between applications and vacancies. And so actually applications have surged in the higher pay range even before vacancies did. And so although it's still not an application-rich territory, it's much more reliable in terms of getting interest than the middle pay ranges. And then if we go on to the last sector, healthcare is quite an interesting one, of course, because it's not been on the demand side prone to the vagaries of the pandemic in terms of demand. There's been a sort of a consistent demand for roles in this sector. And here it's quite interesting that the supply side has been a bit more staid and a bit more stable in terms of the number of applications, although it's quite volatile in that middle pay range category. Overall, the change is much more muted, and that's interesting. Healthcare, of course, isn't kind of an entirely open labour market. A lot of salaries are set by central policy prescriptions through pay review bodies and so on, and so that means that your alternative options are less. And so in a way, it's not as easy to extract the benefit of a seller's market as will be in those more private sector dominated markets in hospitality and computing.
Interesting. Thank you, Duncan. Fascinating view. And I think if I recall some of the conversations last time with David, thinking about hospitality, which was facing a real acute wider labour market challenge, kind of turning to apprenticeships as in hope it might fill holes that hadn't been expected as furlough was wound back, and it sort of suggests that the kind of maybe gone in at the wrong level, so to speak, to really take advantage of the candidate pool that was available, but maybe showing that sort of top end side of hospitality that maybe some employers have kind of worked it out and are moving to a higher level perhaps, or different segments of the hospitality market as well perhaps at play there. So yeah, that should be enlightening and hopefully very helpful to help employers sort of navigate this environment and think about how they best position apprenticeships as a viable route through and an attractive route through that might negate some of the wider labour market challenges out there. So I hope David's able to use this resource to kind of encourage employers to think slightly differently about apprenticeships and where they pitch them in their business going forward. So fascinating research. Thank you, Duncan. So we move on now to actually think more broadly and tee up the second part of what we wanted to cover off today, which is really thinking about how we're seeing employers respond. And we've hinted at it there. We've done a little dive and looked at the obvious measure around wage, although of course within as you mentioned, within the construct of apprenticeships, which works within certain standard parameters more generally, and picked out and highlighted segments of the economy that maybe have that less open nature to wage. But of course, wage is not the only lever that employers have to pull at a time like this. So you're going to walk us through now some research that you've done here for the UK, but aligns to work we've been doing in North America as well, sister research, to really try and get a grip of what's going on out there in the labour market and how employers are responding. So I'll hand back to you and your post-COVID cough.
Yes, that's a particularly enjoyable feature of having had COVID with hardly any symptoms, but then it comes to get you anyway. So, as Andy said, we've sort of done this research partly because we'd kind of got done the same old story about the labour market recovery over this last few months, and so it became a bit more interesting to find out how employers are responding to that. You know, this chart on the screen now we've looked at lots of times, and we know that the unemployment rate continues to fall, really quite surprisingly fast speed. That vacancies are in record territory. I think as of this week we're now in the above 1.2 million categories as of I guess that would be October data, and redundancies are kind of completely back to normal. So that's the kind of the background of the tight labour market. But if we can go on to the next slide, we've been interested to see, well, what does that mean for the workplace? And so the first thing that we did was we took the data that the ONS provide on job-to-job moves from different occupational categories to really see sort of, well, you know, is that causing higher churn? And it's interesting because actual intentions to look for new jobs haven't particularly sort of peaked or anything. There's not a lot of evidence for that, but people are moving jobs. And first of all, if you look at the purple and the green lines here, those are high-skilled jobs, which are managerial, professional, and technical, and then middle-skilled jobs, which are things like care workers, administrators, plumbers, electricians. And both of those are looking pretty positive, actually. You know, that after really falling back quite sharply on the onset of the pandemic, they're now back up into really quite robust territory, slightly higher or about the same as we saw before the pandemic, which was a tight labour market as it was. But the really interesting one here are the low-skilled workers. So these include, you know, factory workers, waiters, bartenders, customer service staff, things like that. And you can see that here the measure, so the measure is the number of people within a quarter that are moving from a low-skilled job to a different job. And so it's really a sense of how much turnover there is in that labour market. And you can see that it's at a level that's higher than we've seen ever on this measure, which goes back to before the financial crisis. So it's really jolted upwards over the last few quarters. And so now in a quarter, we expect, and this is the third quarter of this year, I think it was. We can see that actually, you know, almost 1 in 20 people in low-skilled jobs change jobs that quarter. And of course, what that suggests is that there are other opportunities for them to go to, that they can move straight from one job to another. And that normally implies, speaking with my economist trade union membership intact, that there's something better in those other jobs, that they're moving from one job to the next because the sort of the offer, be it pay, be it conditions, be it the people that you're working for or with, offer some benefit over where you are now. And you can see how even when we had a tight labour market before the pandemic, that was more like 3.5% typically, and now it's moving up towards 5% in a quarter. So it's really quite a striking level of turnover that we've suddenly moved to. Whether this is partly a catch-up on lower job moves during the earlier stages of the pandemic, or whether it's a reflection of just how high the demand is relative to supply, will take a while to unpick, but it is on its face a very interesting measure. So you can go on to the next.
Just a quick question, actually. As you described that, you mentioned at the beginning that the intentions to change jobs were quite low, but the actuality higher. is that we know that the lower, from our previous webinars, that the lower skilled end of the market had been disproportionately affected by the early lockdowns and more likely to be found in furlough conditions, etc., etc. So is it a matter of necessity rather than choice, or maybe driven by necessity, but it just so happens there is now more choice?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. If it was driven by necessity, i.e. you were losing your job otherwise, you would implicitly think that more people would go from a job to unemployment and then to another job, because it's not a time of your choosing, if that makes sense. So there could be some of that, although generally the evidence on the ending of furlough is that most employers said that they were keeping their staff, and it's a very small share. I mean, literally sort of, I think it's 10% or something. The employers said would be potentially losing their jobs. So I think, yes, that's not enough to explain it on its own.
Well, with furlough, we weren't earning 100% wages necessarily, and so it might have taken people beyond a minimum limit. So there was, even though they didn't need to lost their job, they did need to make up for that. Or, of course, more time to scan and consider and train and learn and think about what might be a more viable career going forward.
Yeah, it's interesting on that, because and there could be some of that again. I think that the interesting side is that this has really surged in the sort of third quarter of this year, by which time not that many. You think if you were, it's probably the second quarter that you'd have expected to see more of a surge from that, and it was surging. So it's not to say that it wasn't part of it then, but it is interesting in the third quarter of this year, when the labour market had a relatively low level of furlough, and actually, most workplaces were sort of back in action and seeking labour, that actually we are just seeing a lot of turnover.
Yeah, fascinating.
So what we did as well is that we also, using the same occupational groups, looked at how labour market demand has changed in terms of recruitment, because obviously, part of any higher turnover is that you'd expect to see higher recruitment demand. And so we've expressed it as a share of employment over time. So it kind of is a similar basis to that sort of job to job moves data before. And what you can see is that, first of all, high skill demand, just as on the turnover chart, has kind of returned to a sort of a pre-pandemic position. It's strong, but it's not strong in a way that is unheard of before. Whereas low and middle skill work, both of them this time, are really in a position that is kind of higher than has been in the time that we've been collecting this kind of data, which goes all the way back to 2012. And so, again, you can see from the demand side that there is that pull effect there, that, reflecting the ONS data on vacancy volumes, there is just a really high level of demand. And what's interesting, and this is a real distinction to the labour market over really the past 15 years, if anything, is that actually low skill demand is so high and is difficult to meet. We have talked before about the sort of the fact that migration has kind of really slowed down, and so that's been a key source of meeting low skill labour market demand over the past decade. And so, you really do get this sense of it becoming a very tight seller's market. So, and we've been discussing this central question about how much further can the labour market tighten, and really, you do wonder if it can go much further. That we've got recruitment, in every industry way ahead, high, middle, and low skilled jobs, all in high demand. I mean, if we go back to the ONS labour market data, with 1.2 million vacancies, before August, it had never been above 1 million before. It gives you a sense of just how astounding these numbers are. And that, just as I was saying a moment ago, that it's these low and middle skilled jobs that are really seeing that kind of highest turnover, and low skilled jobs with the greatest change in turnover, which does sort of give that suggestion of a real structural change going on in the labour market, and how long that will last and what its kind of consequence will be is going to be really interesting to see. And then that last point there about when and how the labour market will find new equilibrium. It will have to find new equilibrium. The labour market is running so hot at the moment that it's difficult to see how it can continue to do so. And so what will happen is over time that employers will have to change how they offer jobs, how they think of jobs. Employees will then find jobs that better suit them. And so over time, these conditions will start to dissipate. But what we don't know is what the consequence of that will be in the long haul. Will it mean, for example, that this high level of turnover and demand in low skill work will cause employers to have to bid up what they offer workers in that labour market? And will that mean a sort of a permanent change in the relationship of the low skill labour market to the rest of the labour market in terms of paying conditions, for example?
And presumably, Duncan, as labour becomes more expensive, investment in technology becomes more attractive.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you see this kind of even in recent times that sort of relatively low skill employers facing higher costs from the minimum wage, for example, and facing difficulty in finding the right workers. McDonald's is a good example here. When faced with high labour costs, they've invested in those automated checkout machines that you can put your order into. It's interesting that they were developed by McDonald's in Europe, I think in France originally, because of high labour costs, rather than its home country of the US, because it's much easier to find people at a range of skill levels and pay in the US. So yeah, there will certainly be an incentive for employers to think about how they can better use technology to either complement or substitute low skilled labour in their production processes.
Interesting. So thinking about what employers can do, what have we been looking into?
Yeah, so we wanted to kind of just see, what are the early measures that we've got in terms of how employers are responding, and we didn't want to confine it to pay, because pay is quite a blunt measure, and especially at the low skill end, because we've had quite a prolonged period of raising the minimum wage. Actually, there's a large number of workers that are on the minimum wage now, and so employers in the lowest skilled jobs often use the minimum wage as just a default pay rate anyway, so it's not always the best measure. But we wanted to just explore pay and some other areas, things like bonuses for signing on, because we've had a lot of stories about those, about the offer of training, which has a double benefit, because it's partly a benefit to employees, but it's also a way that employers can use to widen the candidate pool, because they can say, we don't mind if you haven't got the skills now, we're happy to train you up. We wanted to have a look at benefits in terms of retirement pensions, especially because although the big change was in 2019, I think, in terms of the increase in pension contributions, we wanted to see if employers were talking about it more, and then we wanted to explore flexible working and working from home as well. So if we come on to the first one, so with pay, what we've used is the ONS data with HMRC, which comes from the pay-as-you-earn system. And so what they do is they track every month the number of employees and how much they are getting paid, and they do it by industry, and they've got data back over a few years. And so the sort of the dark blue bars here represent the sort of the pay change from October 2019 to October 2021. So that should take account of not get distorted by certain kinds of workers being more likely to have been furloughed or lost their jobs during the pandemic, because we're comparing the most recent data, so when the recovery is well underway, to the pre-COVID data. And then the orange dots do the same over the preceding 2 years, so it gives a good comparison. And the red line here is the total change across the economy. And so in some ways, what you see at the top is what you'd expect. The fastest pay growth is in finance and insurance, professional services, information and communication. So far, so predictable. What's a bit more interesting is that you see the contrast with transportation and storage, an industry that we've heard a lot about over the past year or so, because it was an important part of dealing with the pandemic. And of course, it's also seen a lot of shortages. And you can see there that pay in that industry has just about kept pace with the rest of the economy over the past 2 years. But it's much faster growth. It's about 8 to 9% over that 2 years, which is much faster growth than over the preceding 2 years, which was really about 3%, slower than inflation over that time. And so you can see that although transportation and storage hasn't seen such massive pay growth, it's actually really accelerated from what it was like before, where it was really bad for pay. And so that's one that's really interesting. And then at the bottom is another interesting one, accommodation and food service activities, because we know that that's in high demand and fast growing, and we saw that on the Get My First Job data earlier on as well. But we can see that actually, while pay wasn't too bad in the 2 years preceding, pay growth more recently has been quite sluggish. So employers in that sector don't seem to be rushing to offer better pay. So that's the story on pay, which is potentially mixed signals and interesting. So if we go on to the next one, the other ones we've used are job postings data. And what we've done is we've also differentiated it between education levels to really get a sense of how employers are responding to the sort of the labour market in these kind of low skilled versus high skilled settings. And so the first one we look at are all manner of signing on bonuses mentioned in the job ad. And you can see that the really interesting story here is on the below degree side. And first of all, you get this big surge during the early stages of the pandemic. Now, this is slightly misleading because actually that reflecting the fact that these jobs that offer signing on bonuses were more likely to be still there while other adverts fell down around them. But then you've got these two other surges, which are much more organic, and they reflect the sort of the underlying labour market conditions. So you get one toward the end of 2020. As we went through the autumn period, they became a lot more frequent. And then that fell off again at the end of 2020 and early 2021 as we had the further lockdown. I almost said the final lockdown, but I don't want to tempt it at the moment. And then over the past few months, it's really kind of gone up a long way. So we're talking about 2.5 times the presence of signing on bonuses that we saw before the pandemic. So a really big change, actually. But with degree or higher jobs, there has been this spike recently, but that was a 1 month only thing. So I treat that with a lot of caution. And generally, signing on bonuses don't seem to be such a feature of the degree or higher environment. And of course, this reflects what we were looking at earlier, that the turnover amongst high skilled jobs is much more normal, good, but normal. And so, it's a good leading indicator, it seems like, about where employers are just really competing fiercely for talent. And of course, the real attraction to signing on bonuses in the competitive labour market, because it's a one-off cost as opposed to raising salaries, which can mean your cost base is higher into the future.
Just a quick point that jumps into my mind. Those eagle-eyed viewers will see that the percentages are quite low here on the scale. Yeah. And I suppose a contextual piece is, of course, we're looking for this being explicitly mentioned in job postings, which realistically is probably going to be the tip of the iceberg, isn't it, in terms of what's mentioned right up front, as opposed to what emerges perhaps through the recruitment process and negotiation process. So
absolutely,
reflecting a percentage of where bonuses are absolutely paid, but more a sense of the fact that it's interesting, even if we're just thinking about the tip of the iceberg, that it's being mentioned more prevalent.
Yeah, absolutely. And it should be said, in normal times, signing on bonuses aren't a normal feature of the labour market. So that they're not that prevalent. But it is interesting. A personal anecdote is that we were going through Derby the other day for some reason. I think it was to see the in-laws, and I saw a garage at the side of the road, one of the big kind of automotive dealerships, and they actually had a sign advertising for technicians, and they were offering £1,000 bonuses with it. And that's the thing. Now, we don't count side of the road adverts in our job postings data because they're not digital, but it does give you an idea that it's a lot more open as an offer at the moment. And so, that there is something about this is a very marginal kind of indicator. You know, no employer wants to have to offer signing on bonuses if they can avoid it, because recruitment's a costly business as it is. Yeah, but it is interesting that they're choosing to use this tactic as a way of attracting people to apply. So the next one, and this one is a lot more prevalent in job ads, and you can see the sort of the magnitudes are a lot higher, is around the offer of training. And as I said a moment ago, training is partly a potential benefit, because as an employee you think, I'll learn more skills that I can maybe shop around later. But it also is a way of widening the candidate pool, because you can think about you know, it's like with the HGV driver story a few months ago. You know, if you offer training, what you're saying is, we accept that you won't be fully productive for us in the first few months, maybe, but we're going to take you on anyway, because it's worth it for us to bear the cost of your pay for those few months while you train. And you do that in order to widen the number of potential candidates. And again, there's a real difference here between below degree and degree or higher jobs. Amongst below degree jobs, there has been quite a sustained increase from typically around sort of 6% to around 9% now. So, you know, a sort of around a 50% increase in the prevalence of offering training, again, as you say, explicitly in a job ad. And what's interesting here is that really did start in the lockdown at the start of this year. Earlier in the pandemic, there was no real difference, and actually it started to fall away toward the end of last year. But then probably from around sort of February-ish, it started to increase, and hasn't really stopped. In degree or higher roles, it has seen a sort of a bit of a recovery from a small dip earlier in the pandemic, but it is generally more stable. And so, yeah, the offer of training to widen the candidate pool and as a potential benefit is very much focused again on those lower skilled roles. Now, pensions is an interesting one. Again, it gets mentioned in quite a lot of job postings. And we were interested to see whether this gets mentioned more. Back in early 2019, the sort of the law changed on mandatory employer pension contributions. And so you can see a slight sort of pickup in both degree or higher and below degree and mentions of pension contributions there. But what's interesting on the below degree side, again, is that even though that law has remained in place, during this year of 2021, the sort of the mention of it has gone up more and more. And again, you take this as a way of employers just communicating the full package of what they offer. Whereas before, you might say, well, that's implicit, everybody will do this pension contribution. Now you just want to sort of really kind of lay it out for employees that we're not only paying you this, but we'll give you this pension contribution as well. And so it's all about kind of making the most of your case to prospective candidate. And so this one's an interesting one. So flexible working is about your ability to set your own schedule and the number of hours that you have. And it's interesting because you would have thought with the increase in home working and things like that, which we'll come back to in a moment, that this might have seen a real change with the pandemic. And amongst below degree roles, that certainly was the case, although that's probably because the sort of the more flexibly schedulable roles at below degree level held up better in terms of demand than otherwise. But amongst degree or higher roles, which have seen by far the biggest shift in working from home, where you might accept that people not sticking to the same office hours is relatively not a problem. It's really just continued the trend that was there before the pandemic. It hasn't really changed a lot. So that's quite an interesting one. Whereas in below degree roles, after that initial spike, it's kind of gone back down, and sort of, it seems like we're also back on the trend beforehand. So it's not that every margin of potential benefit is being explored here.
I wonder if it's becoming more implied at the higher end,
yes.
Perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I mean, sort of people working from home have a degree of flexibility that you don't have to explain so much. So that may well be true. But it is interesting that it's not really being kind of emphasised any more than it was on the path to being before, really.
Yeah.
And so our final one is about working from home, which of course has been a sort of a major topic of conversation over the past 18 months, 2 years. And no surprise, especially amongst degree or higher roles, you see an explosion as the pandemic started, going from sort of 2.5% offering working from home as part of the job description back in 2019 to sort of 6 or 7% straight away early on in the pandemic. But what's interesting is that it's kind of continued to move up over time and has stayed stable throughout 2021. In the below degree category, there's also a similar effect, but from a much lower base. But it is interesting to see it there, because in below degree roles, there's a much higher share of roles that have to be done in physical proximity. If you think about warehouse workers or waiters, you can't really be a waiter by working from home as such. It kind of defeats the object. So so even there, where it is more difficult to allow people to work from home, you have seen this kind of sustained increase after the initial jolt, and then it kind of working its way through. What's interesting is that it hasn't changed that much during 2021. It's sustained, but whereas this is a potential benefit, or it certainly is for a lot of workers anyway, it isn't being emphasised any more than it was before. Now, of course, there's a countervailing pressure here, because some employers might want to reserve their position, because a lot of employers remain kind of keen, we understand, to get some degree of office working back in the future, although at the moment it feels as far away as it has for quite some time.
Yes, good, interesting, thank you. So quick of that before we bring David back into the conversation.
Yeah, so I think the headlines are, the labour market having tightened as we've seen it has. Employers are changing to adapt to that, and of course, they're doing exactly what they should. They're emphasising, in some cases they're raising pay, in some cases they're emphasising benefits that are already there, in some cases they're adding new benefits like bonuses, or widening their pool by offering training. And bonuses and training especially are quite striking for less educated roles, as ways that they're just sort of waiving the signing on bonus and saying, we'll train you if you're not quite job ready yet. And the working from home thing is interesting, because the change seems to be sustained, but it doesn't seem to be going much further now. And so, that's an interesting position for that one.
Yeah, interesting. And I wonder, just my summary is, I'm going to use a horrible cliche here, but it does feel like there's maybe a degree of levelling up happening within the labour market. So obviously, the government's agenda is more a geographic one, but actually perhaps seeing investment at the lower ends of the labour market to something that has been more established at the higher ends of the labour market, the higher skilled ends of the labour market for some time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you do get a sense of a real change in the terms of trade at the moment, and whether that sustains, we'll see over next year. But at the moment, it does feel like a much better labour market to be low skilled in, certainly than last year, which was an awful time in that labour market. But even compared to 2017, 2018, 2019.
Yeah, great, thank you. Some fascinating stuff there, and we'll point you shortly into the direction of where you can learn more about some of this work that Duncan and colleagues have been working on. So thank you, Duncan. So I'm going to introduce David, Allison again, co-founder and CEO at GetMyFirstJob. So David, welcome to our session today. Some fascinating stuff there, and obviously we were looking at the sort of broader labour market holistically. So just interested, as an organisation that focuses in at the younger end and the new entrants to the labour market, particularly with a strong emphasis towards apprenticeships. Interested to see get your take on some of those trends, and whether you're feeling similar or different trends affecting your more niche end of the labour market.
Hi, morning, Andy. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, because the early talent market, so those effectively leaving full-time education and joining the labour market for the first time, they are part of the overall labour kind of process. They're subject to the same supply and demand, but there are a couple of things that make them a bit different. First is that they are a fixed cohort. So, as we were hearing earlier on from Duncan, there are a number of people who are maybe in jobs, who hadn't planned to change, but something comes up that's actually looks really good, so therefore they will move on. We can't simply go out and grow another 200,000 16 to 18-year-olds to drop into the labour market simply because there's more demand for employers. So that fixed cohort is one thing. And the other is then around the education cycle. So there are some enforced peaks and troughs in that cycle. So certainly around September, October. Increasingly, we're seeing around Jan, Feb as well. But the rest of the time, it's a very, very different situation without as much freedom. So increasingly, what we actually then look at is to say the early talent market operates pretty much in isolation, albeit that it's subject to those same pressures. And particularly when you have kind of excess demand from the overall labour market, and therefore things like hospitality, as we were talking about earlier on, where they're suddenly needing to bring in more people, they can't fill them any other way, so therefore we'll look at young people particularly to drag into full-time roles. So with that in mind, you then have to think about, okay, so the early talent market is in effect a ring-fenced one, and the competition exists within that one market. And therefore, it's subject to the same kind of things as Duncan was talking about earlier on. So pay, undoubtedly. I think it's fascinating to look at the way Duncan had represented some of that imbalance between supply and demand and the changes in salary. And when you look at hospitality as a really good example, you can see that as soon as the hospitality market began to put out vacancies at a higher pay rate, all of a sudden, all of the applications swung straight towards those higher paying jobs. And as a result, you have far lower applications on the lower paying roles, whereas in social care, you don't have the same thing because those high vacancy roles don't exist. So really interesting, quite acute swings, even within very small segments of that early talent market.
Yeah, very interesting. And so if we think about the two sides of that market, the employers being, of course, the key stakeholder, and that's been largely the focus of discussion and your answer there. What about from the other side of the coin, though, from training providers and educators? Are we seeing some shift in behavior or discussions? Are we hearing chatter about anything that might be changing on that side? Or is it business as usual, fixed cohort, certain cycles? That's our lot. Our job is to get them ready. Off you go. You hearing anything in that realm?
I think it's very interesting to look at the way in which the apprenticeship market particularly is kind of fragmenting. So you have some of the larger employers who are directly involved with the recruitment of their own kind of future apprentices, who are really driving innovation in this market. And therefore, they're bringing to the apprenticeship table the sort of things we've heard about from the overall labour market. So really great kind of vacancies which describe progression, describe culture, describe what it's like to work there in a really nice, very, very well thought through employee value proposition way. And they're now at the same kind of table. If you go to find an apprenticeship, go to get my first job, you look at the job listings, but we're then seeing, if you like, very old fashioned, I'd say, vacancies from some training providers, which are just long lists of tasks that you would do as a level 2 business admin apprentice. And in this labour market, that kind of advert just does not stand a fair chance. It doesn't stand any chance at all, because the same young people are able to see what they could be doing. So I think there are some training providers who have really upped their game and have understood that actually in this market, the recruitment of young people is not a freebie to be thrown away because you can simply stick an advert up and you'll get 100 applicants. There are training providers who are doing it incredibly well and are actually now charging commercially for that service. And those that think that it is still something you can just chuck a vacancy out there and you'll get loads of applicants, they're really not able to deliver the services that, if you like, they're promising to employers, because the people don't exist in that market for a low pay or a traineeship role that are going to be of sufficient quality that employers would want to take on. So yeah, it's a very interesting and very dynamic situation.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And obviously, as someone who's been in and around the sector myself for a long time, that move to employer providers was quite a challenge to the sector and not necessarily an exciting one. I think there were sort of furrowed brows looking at that and thinking, well, can an employer possibly be a training provider? We're very different. But actually, it's fascinating to hear at this time of real pressure that perhaps the fact that these employers are really describing recruitment, not just training, should present perhaps a bit of a yardstick maybe for training providers who want to serve a community of employers who don't have that scale that affords them that ability to own the whole process. They will, training providers who can act like a recruitment organization to really truly sell the company, sell the job, sell the career, feels like are going to be in a stronger position in the market to attract employers and as well as students to great outcomes relative to the old school traditional approach that you described. So anything to add on? Would you concur with that? And are you seeing those sorts of moves happening, or is that your sort of wish list for 2022 for the training provider market, is to think differently?
I think first on the employer provider kind of point, yeah, I do more than raise a single eyebrow on that one. And I think what we're seeing is that many large employers, you've had a go at being a provider as well. They don't, it's not their core business. But what they do see is the value in differentiating between recruitment, which is one area of expertise, and training delivery, which is another. So most large corporates we work with, they will be working very closely with a training provider or a range of different training providers, each of whom have their own expertise. They'll then want to manage recruitment separately. And of course, they've been doing this for years when it comes to graduate recruitment. So we're kind of seeing that those early talent teams are now running a series of programs, which includes school leavers, internships, work experience, apprenticeships, and also graduates. And they're really thinking about how they can address things like social mobility and inclusion across all of those different streams as one. And those are really interesting conversations to have, and probably outside the competence of an awful lot of I think, training providers and colleges. So to your second question then, I think, the wish list for next year is that I think training providers and colleges really need to understand what goes into a fully fledged recruitment package, which is going to be competitive and deliver for employers. The worst case is that in terms of apprenticeships as a whole, we aren't able to deliver up to employers what we say we will, because very quickly then you end up with a disengagement around the whole apprenticeship agenda because I wasn't able to get access to talent you promised me to. So that, really taking time to look at it and understand it before making commitments to employers and before just agreeing to stick an advert on a job site and hoping it will give you results, because there's no sign that it will do.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, fantastic insights. And David, thank you so much for the last couple of months where we've worked together on illuminating some of these trends, and for being generous with your time and some of the data and insights that you have. I think it's an important work, and I hope people value it, and I hope you and your communities can utilize the combined efforts of the reports we've been working on in these webinars. It's been fun. Too long in coming.
And I've really enjoyed Duncan as well, who showed me all sorts of new ways of presenting data, which is a subject close to my heart. So there we go.
So fascinating, and thank you very much for bringing your insights to our community. It's been fantastic. And on that point, really, I think just to sum up, there is crazy stuff going on out there, but certainly exciting, and there's still massive opportunity. And what we're seeing is obviously on the candidate or the employee side, lots of opportunity and it's a great opportunity for the best employers, training providers, etc., to really excel and showcase their capabilities. So it really does favor those who invest time and effort into these things. We are seeing great intensity of selectivity and job hopping, which should really keep all of us on our toes as we go forward, and reassuring to see at the lower skilled end of the labour market that some degree of perhaps levelling up parity is emerging there, and interesting to hear how that's translating into the ring-fenced early talent market as much as the wider labour market as well. So if you found this interesting, I mentioned the first part of the report, which is now out on the Emsi Burning Glass blog, and the second part, which will summarise a lot of the more detailed sector views that we shared today will be coming in due course, likely I think in the new year now, so keep an eye out for that one. And also the report we've released this week that that Duncan was summarizing there in terms of how employers are responding to the labour market crunch. That report again should be found on our blog now, so if you found that interesting and and you wanted to dive into the detail, then please do visit the blog. There's a link on the page there. As Debbie mentioned at the outset, slides will be circulated, so you should have that. Looking to the new year, oh look, a new photo of me. Duncan and I will be reconvening and talking a little bit more in the new year at a more local level, and thinking about how different regions and localities are recovering from the disruption, and probably some of the trends that we've talked about today. Interested to see how those manifest in more specific local areas, because of course we've been looking at the high level of late there. And I think that just leaves me in a very classy way to wish everyone a fantastic Christmas and holiday period. Thanks for all of your work that you've been doing through the last 12 months of great disruption and challenge and opportunity. I hope that we've been helpful to that work. I want to say a massive thank you to David, and Merry Christmas to David and his team and his family. I want to say a Merry Christmas to the Emsi Burning Glass team as well, for the hard work that they've done through the year and the great impact they've had at a time where, of course, we have a great opportunity to serve and to help all of you. I think we've struggled with a lot to pack in today, and we've run out of time, so apologies that we haven't been able to get to any of those questions, but we'll try and answer those as we go. And I'll finally say a big Merry Christmas and thank you to Debbie, who manages all of our webinars and helps us through minor crises of technical incompetence through the year. And so thank you, Debbie, and I will hand back to you.
That's great. Thank you, Andy. Yes, happy Christmas, everybody, and thank you for attending today. So we'll see you in the new year. Bye-bye.